Arvind Virmani, former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, President of the Forum for Strategic Initiative and Chintan. Mr. Virmani, thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg Quint. Firstly, what is your assessment of this backdated GDP series on two counts? One is, did it really represent the growth of the previous decade? Do the new numbers truly represent the growth of the new decade? Let's start with your initial observations first.
So, over the last year, I was talking to people in the Department of Statistics, the statistical people, and I had heard that they had this thing, but they were not sure for two reasons. One was that the MCI series actually starts in 96-97, which has formed an important base for the 2011-12 series, the new series. And secondly, there was a change in the MCI approach from a couple of years later, I don't remember exactly, but 98 or 99, they changed it. So my general impression before this series came out, that the back series till around 99 or 2000 would be relatively easy to do, but going beyond it backwards would be a little difficult. So there is a issue there, but let's take that as given for the time being and discuss the series. Now clearly it makes it easier for us, for me as an economist, to do two things. One is it helps, even though the series is not perfect, it helps me look forward and make estimates of the potential GDP of the economy, because without the back series that becomes very difficult. You can't do it on the basis of 7-8 data points. You need at least 15 or 20 to be able to make judgments about the future. That is one aspect. And the second thing is that I wouldn't really put too much emphasis on the exact year-to-year ratio. So I generally growth rates. So I basically look at it more from the medium long-term perspective, which is at least I take a kind of 7-year, 10-year averages to look at long-term growth trends. So these are the two preliminary points I would make.
Okay, Dr. Virmani, I'll come to the potential growth rate and what you make of it based on this series. But let me first, sort of get the political economy debate out of the way a little bit as well. Even if one looks at it point to point, is it not fair to say that one has to, bring together other economic variables in the years that we are talking about, or in the years before that, the years after that, to understand what led to the growth and what that growth led to?
Right. Yeah. So again, we have two points here. One is that again, from my perspective, looking at growth, I look at reforms and the connection of reforms to growth. So clearly, there are lags to growth, as I've shown in many of my papers, as something I call the J curves of reform, growth and productivity. That if you have major reforms like we've had in the 90s, there's always a lag to seeing that translate into a growth acceleration. And what I pointed out in this J-curve paper, which is also an IMF working paper, is that you can actually get a slight decline in growth if you do major reforms. So that is one point, the lag between reforms and when you see the growth. And your second point is also correct. You can have, the way we look at it in growth theory is sustainable growth versus bubbles, right? So the point you made is exactly correct. I have argued this for a long time, not just with the new data, but with the old data, was that 2010, 2011, I was a CEA till the end of 2009, and I had very clearly made clear to everybody who would listen is that we need a stimulus to recover from the global financial crisis, but as soon as growth rate goes back anywhere near the 7-8%, we must reverse this stimulus. Now unfortunately that did not happen in 2010-11, and therefore I consider that 10% in that year actually as part of the bubble, which subsequently gave you all kinds of problems. You have correctly pointed out that inflation went up, etc., the fiscal deficit, the current account deficit. Because that was an unsustainable bubble, we would obviously discount it, and we would look at the other macro factors, as you correctly pointed out.
Dr. Virmani, do these new numbers, at least the presence of a backdated GDP number, make you change your mind or review what the government back then did during the years 2010-11 and the policy response that happened during that time? Would you change your mind at all about what was done at that juncture?
No, I don't think I changed my mind on either of the 2 points I made. I've been making these points since 2010-11. Both the macro unsustainability point and the growth. I actually remember an interview I gave before I left in October 2009, where I clearly pointed these out. I think it was to some southern newspaper or TV. I don't remember the exact thing, but I remember saying this, that if you want sustained growth, we must step up the pace of reforms and reverse the stimulus which we had given. The stimulus was very valid when your growth collapses. I don't think people remember how bad the global financial crisis was, and it was a big negative shock which could have taken us down to zero or negative growth. So that stimulus at that point was absolutely essential, and I think the numbers, I don't remember exactly, I think it went, even despite the stimulus, the 2008-9 growth went down to roughly 2-3%, I think it is. So the stimulus was very necessary in 2009, but we then recovered fairly quickly, and then that was a point to reverse it. And I had made this point in an interview. Of course, internally I had been saying it to people. I was leaving, so I had no influence on the policy after that, but I did make it clear to the to the concerned people, I don't want to mention individuals, that this should be done if the growth recovers.
Dr. Virmani, the
and
other
they didn't
point
do
you
it.
made in your
I mean, they actually, there was, yeah.
No, sorry, please complete your thought.
Yeah. Right. So in fact, they did the reverse, because there was a windfall gain from spectrum auctions in 2010. And not only did they not use it to reduce the fiscal deficit, they actually spent more than that extra amount. So in some sense, it was the reverse of what one had recommended when one left.
Dr. Virmani, I was going to go back to one of the points you made in your initial comments, and that is on what this series now tells us about potential growth for the economy. What is your judgment? Would you still say that potential growth for the Indian economy is in the early 7s, up to about 7.5 perhaps? And in that sense, given the current year's projected growth rate, we are, well, fairly close to potential.
Right. So here is how I would analyze that. I mean, before the new series came, I have a paper which was presented at OECD, which basically put the potential growth rate of the Indian economy at that point at between 8 and 8.5%. Now, since the global financial crisis, the question becomes, how much has the global environment worsened compared to the pre-GFC period? And my guess would be between 0.5 and 0.1%. So in that sense, the potential may have gone down by at 0.5% to 1% from what I had earlier estimated. The new data kind of confirms that, but I believe that if the pace of reform, which has now accelerated in my view from the previous 10 years, is continued into the next 5 to 10 years, you don't have to do huge big bang reforms. I think people have this mistaken notion that big bang is what works. No, you have to keep at it. So if they keep at this pace of reform which we have seen in the last 4 or 5 years, then I believe that you can get close to that old level of 8 to 8.5% despite the worsened global environment.
Okay, Mr. Virmani, if I can bring you to the data points of today, for instance, 2 aspects. One is CAD, that is widened significantly, and this is not just oil imports, even non-oil imports like gold has widened significantly. Is it a cause of concern? And secondly, the unprecedented fall that we've seen in the rupee. It may have retraced some lost ground today, but are these signals of alarm for you, or do you think this is par for the course?
Yeah, right. So that's an excellent question, because very different people have different views, and I think it's very important for my view to be on the table. What I have seen in my 20 years or more in government is that whenever things become good, people forget the importance of fiscal control. that's why the last 4 years I have consistently said that we must keep on the trend to fiscal deficit. And also we have forgotten the revenue deficit. In my last economic survey in 2009, I actually laid out a 10-year suggestion to reduce the fiscal deficit to zero and the revenue deficit. Now, people have forgotten the importance of revenue deficit, so let me very quickly explain. The revenue deficit is approximately equal to the net dis savings of the government, and the net dis savings is very important for both our credit rating, the external imbalance, the amount of capital inflows we need, the current account, and many other things, related things. So I would reiterate, despite Mr. N.K. Singh is a friend and an old colleague of mine, or my old boss, but I disagree with his committee report. That committee decided that revenue deficit is not important. I still believe it's important, and the reason I've just outlined to you. So to directly come to your question, yes, there is a risk, and we must stay on that trend of reducing fiscal and revenue deficit if we want to reduce the risk. And the risk is now rising. This is the problem. So if the more you reduce the fiscal deficit in good times, the more insurance you have in bad times. And it becomes more and more difficult when the external environment becomes bad to reduce it then. So, this is one of those long-term things which only old people like me remember, because one has been through many, many such crises over the time I have been in government.
Not old, Dr. Virmani, experienced. Lovely to have had you here on the show. Thanks so much for all your views, both on the debate on the new series, plus also on the current economic situation.